Hello and welcome back to another episode of So You Started in Big Four. My name is Kyle Gantos, and I'm excited to dive into a topic today with a couple special guests that affects all of our lives on a day-to-day basis, and that is failure, and more specifically, how failure can propel us rather to the best version of ourselves. I think a lot of times in the workplace, failure is kind of faux pas. It's frowned upon. It's imperfections. It's not. We tend to focus so much on success that I think a lot of times we take for granted, at least publicly, that success really is a product of failure and learning from those failures more specifically. So excited to get vulnerable with two leaders that I have a lot of respect for. Not only, again, both really talented at what you do, but I just think authentic people who don't mind peeling back some of the layers and walking us through that. So, Brian, welcome back to the show, man. How are
Thank
you?
you for having me. I'm doing well.
Good. Jonathan, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
Doing well.
Good.
So let's cut right to it. I want to, if you guys will humor me here, let's hop in the time machine and let's go back to a point in your life, Brian, where, something didn't work out. And more specifically, maybe on a pretty big scale where you really felt it. I guess, where are we? When are we? Where are we at in your life?
Yeah, so this is not that long ago. There was a client that I had recently joined. And so what this client does is they kind of manage doctor offices. So physician clinics in multiple regions, they kind of do the back end office management for those practices, really letting the doctors focus on patient care and providing for their patients. So we got brought on, and the team that we had in place was really an interim accounting team. The company, their growth strategy and the way that they operate their business is growth through acquisitions. And so over the past couple of years, now this is a brand new company, only about 2 years old. And during that time, they started out with 2 practices and they had grown to 6. So they had basically tripled their business. And what we found was the growth from a practice standpoint didn't necessarily translate into the growth from a corporate standpoint. So what I mean by that is the accounting team that they had in place was probably not well suited to manage the growth that they were experiencing with these practices. And so we were brought on really to help get them kind of up to speed and caught up from an accounting standpoint. And so one of the big responsibilities that we had, and this was something that the company was kind of behind in their processes on, but it was calculating we call it production pay that the doctors receive. So the way that doctors are compensated is they receive their base pay, which is, standard salary, 100,000. They receive biweekly paychecks for that. They also have a collections target based on the patients that they see and the collections that are brought in. And so once they surpass that target, they start collecting, we call it bonus pay, based on a percentage of those collections over target. And so that pay gets issued each month. And so these doctors, the calculation had been done, the doctors were getting their bonus pay, but the step that had been missing was, when you think about anyone receiving a paycheck, typically you get a pay stub, and that pay stub will detail out, here are your collections, here's kind of the detail behind the collections. And so what these doctors had been getting historically was an amount deposited to their bank statement without any insight into what was making up that amount. And we call those physician scorecards, which kind of lays out, here is the base pay that you're receiving in each pay cycle. Here are the collections that you brought in. Here is the calculation that we did based on those collections, based on your target, and applying the percentage. Now, that is a very high level overview of the calculation. I think the reality is there were a lot of nuances and a lot of things that for our team jumping into a messy situation, a team that was kind of behind in their reporting. We were not only trying to balance getting caught up and getting up to speed, but also that accuracy and quality. Something that Embark really emphasizes and preaches. And so I think for our team, it was trying to find that balance between wanting to get caught up, wanting to make sure doctors had visibility into the pay that they were receiving, and also wanting to get the pay issued on time, and making sure that doctors were being compensated in a timely manner.
And this is the goal here would be monthly. How many doctors are we talking about?
I mentioned we had 6 practices. Each practice has, on average, about 10 doctors. So we're looking at calculating pay. And really, those 6 practices operate in 3 regions. So each region has 2 practices and about 20 doctors per region.
Okay.
And so we really calculate it based on the region. And so we have kind of 3 separate calculations that we do. What we ended up finding was we did not have a good enough understanding of the detail that we were using in calculating the doctor pay. So when you look at our calculation, I don't think anything was flawed in the way that we were approaching it. But the step that we had missed, and I think a lot of this had to do with just the hustle and bustle, wanting to get caught up. What we missed was really validating the data that was our starting point in computing the doctor production pay. And so we went through this long exercise of calculate the pay, prepare the scorecards, communicate this to HR, get their buy-in. We went through all of these steps and all of the steps that we needed to do. And we come out the other side where the scorecards are compiled, the doctors are getting paid the next day, and we're sitting there thinking everything is dandy and life is going to go on. What ended up happening was the doctors got paid, and we had a number of questions from the doctors. There was a lot of confusion around, those original inputs that went into the calculation, some of the more nuanced areas around, the collection types. How were those being allocated? How did we determine what was a normal visit versus what was a surgical visit? And we were probably not adequately prepared to field all of those questions that we were receiving. I would say this was not a disconnect, but it was, for me, a big learning experience and something that I didn't have a lot of exposure to. But this process and that calculation, in my mind, is something that is so much more tangible than anything I've ever done in my career. And what I mean by that is the calculation and the work that I was performing had a direct impact on the compensation that these doctors were receiving. And so one small error, whether it was, miscomputing a dollar or allocating Dr. X's collections to Dr. Y, all of those small things that maybe were not material in the calculation and the overall computation had a direct impact on those doctors. And so you can imagine putting yourself in a doctor's shoes, or anyone who's being compensated for the work that they're doing. They want to make sure that they're being compensated fairly. And, I think that was not the sticking point with them and feeling like they were not being compensated fairly, but it was the lack of clarity around how that compensation was calculated and ultimately what the impact was for them. And so for us, it was very much a learning curve of going through this process, kind of in our mind, what are the steps that need to perform, and a little bit of a, maybe a disconnect between ourselves and the doctors about what mattered for them versus, what the action items were for us.
Well, and I think you bring up, there's a few things floating around in my brain right now. One of which is, I would say, traditionally speaking, if you're working for, on a company, financials, or on the accounting side, a lot of this is, there's like a macro component to it where it's, there's all of this, balancing needs to take place, and you've got things in different buckets, and then you have a process, and then you have kind of the client project management experience. And while, I think you've been through that repetition so many times and perform well and have a high standard, I think what I'm hearing you say is there's these other lenses of perspectives that maybe it's not like your process didn't account for, but it's that, after the even something relatively small, right? You have a customer experience that's changing completely for somebody. They're used to it being done this way, and now it's being done this way. There's how that is communicated. And then you have even just on a really micro level, the individual going, hey, I'm used to this, and now this is a different number. And that affects my livelihood, right? So it's almost as if it's the same problem, but from a different perspective. And so now, at least I would imagine, being in your shoes, you've got questions now coming from these doctors who, maybe at one point were kind of an account on a piece of paper. Now it's a real human being. And then you've got, the client potentially even just being like, hey, now we've ruffled some of these feathers, and, maybe there was all good intentions here, but now we have to, work with this. And I'm even thinking of the pressure that you were under at the beginning with, hey, here's a project, here's how we get from point A to desired point B. Everybody's talked through this. We've accounted for as much as we can through due diligence, and we did a lot of things right. But now here we are, and none of us accounted for this necessarily, which is, I think if we're being honest, there's always going to be something that we didn't account for. Something will change, or there will be, again, the pressures and all this stuff going on, limited time. We've got these monthly reports that got to go out across 3 practices, and we want to do well for the client. I don't, to what degree do you think you guys could be in that situation where, I mean, you can only be mindful of so many things at the same time, is in that old saying, like, we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
You've been in a lot of
Yeah.
situations where those same things are happening, not the
Right.
exact same client, but it seems like it would be easy to focus on the 25 things that
Yeah.
add up to success, but that doesn't mean you're going to account for 26, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you took a shortcut or did anything wrong.
Right. It's tricky because there's 2 ways to look at the problem, which I think we being in the spots that we're at, and the interesting component of like what you learned is, or what your experience was, and like the difference there. It's you have the way we're used to looking at everything as accountants is we're used to looking at spreadsheets. We're not used to seeing what's on the other end of that. And so when we go through so much of the stuff, it's so many things are abstract. Like when you talk about things like depreciation or whatever, like those things, while you can explain conceptually, like, okay, like here's what it is that's going on over there, still at the end of the day, what your work ends up looking like is here's a number on a piece of paper, and this thing is being calculated in this way, and I need to make sure that a formula is being spread across this population appropriately, and then we kind of like move on. But then there's this interesting component to this, which is like, this is where we're talking about now we have to look at things from a completely different perspective, which is thinking about things through the doctor's eyes and sitting there and going, like, putting myself inside their shoes. And it's like, well, yeah, like they're going to be sitting there and they're going to go like, okay, so here's my understanding of how each of these different things work. And then they're going to work over there and they're going to do that. And it's like, it's difficult because you have to anticipate that in a space where we're used to not anticipating that, because we're so used to just, okay, it's a formula, it's on here, and I applied it evenly and equally, and I did this thing over here, and all of my logic here is sound. And then knowing, okay, well, what's going to be coming through on the other side of that is somebody sitting down and going like, now I'm going to scrutinize all these different things, and then anticipating like, where am I going to get scrutinized on this? Like, how do I make sure that what ends up affecting people at the end of the day is like, when people are going to see the effects of this is a change to their livelihood, which is very different than how we're used to. Well, these things are, it's applied to a company versus it's applied to a specific individual.
So that's exactly it. And, the fascinating thing behind all of this to me is, from the doctor's standpoint, like they probably had these questions long before we had ever been out there. They just didn't have the insight into the detail because it hadn't been provided for them to even really formulate those questions. So for us, in going through the process, like we almost viewed it as a process improvement because we're adding this documentation
Yep.
that should have been provided all along, and now we're going to get into this cadence where doctors can start seeing their collections and they can start to have that insight. And to your point, what we didn't account for was all these questions that these doctors probably have had all along that they just couldn't like pinpoint, here are the numbers to support what I'm thinking and what I'm wondering. Like now all of a sudden they have that information. And so once they have that, it's not like giving them ammunition for their questions, but in some way it does, because now they have that detail that they can review on their side and make sure that, whatever questions they have on, how are certain items being classified? Are we calculating our over-the-counter costs correctly? All these things that they hadn't been able to see before, now they can. And the piece that they were still missing was the calculation behind that. Because the scorecards that we're providing them are not going to say, hey, here's the number, here's the formula that we applied. What we give them is a PDF that is very high level, in the same way that, if you're an hourly employee, what you get is here's your hours worked, here's your pay rate, and that's the amount. You're not going to see like, here's the formula that we use to calculate that. And so that was the level of detail that the doctors didn't have. And it did open us to those questions that, again, they had probably had all along, but just didn't have the opportunity to ask.
I think there's such like an interesting part there about the concept of transparency. Like we do these things like in the name of transparency in order to make sure that exactly the type of, like, you run into this situation. And it's funny because now having the benefit of hindsight, or having the ability of like being able to look at things from a 30,000 foot view, it's like, yeah, that's kind of what the whole, like the problem that you ran into is kind of the basic point of this whole exercise is we're going to start providing you with a certain amount of transparency into this situation. So that way now all of a sudden you can be, whether it's you need to be educated on like how it is that these things are happening, or that you can sit there and go, hey, wait a second, I don't understand, like, and ask the questions that you want to be able to ask. So it's funny because the problem that you run into ends up being a natural byproduct of what it is, like the very nature of the work that you're doing, where it's like, I'm sure in the moment it doesn't feel like, oh yeah, like this is exactly what the point, like these questions were going to come up. This is exactly the point of like why it is that we're doing this. But it's funny, like looking at it from hindsight perspective, it's like, yeah, that's kind of the point of everything. Like they were going to have questions because, like you said, they didn't have insight into it before.
Absolutely.
What was your specific role in this project?
So my specific role, my title was interim FP&A manager. And so specifically for this process, I was the one directly responsible for 2 of the 3 regions, performing the calculation, gathering the data, and ultimately like doing the calculation that these doctors are getting paid based off of.
Beginning of the project, you sit down, it's scoped out in like, how are you feeling at that point? Like what's going on in your mind, and how do you feel at the beginning of the project?
If I'm being honest, a little bit overwhelmed. Part of that was, this was a new industry for me, so my experience was a lot in transportation and hospitality, consumer goods. So making kind of this transition into healthcare, into that industry, it was a space that I was less familiar with. And then, obviously like the reports and like even just the systems that you're going into to extract the data was a little bit of a foreign concept for me. So I would say there was certainly a ramp up period that was required just from a baseline knowledge perspective. And the other thing I will say is, in all of this, while the increased transparency sounds great and, we're fielding these questions from the doctors, the reality is there were a lot of nuances that we missed in that calculation. And it was not nuances that we missed because of inattention to detail or a lack of care for the client. It was kind of the lack of understanding and being in this time crunch. And so I think that was the hardest part to walk through was, we took so much pride and care in going through the calculation and getting it as accurate as best we could. And then to find out, hey, there's maybe one or two or three things that you didn't account for that you needed to. And then all of a sudden you see, okay, that impacts, this physician's compensation that we've already paid out. That was, it was a challenge. It was certainly a humbling experience, but I think the biggest learning lesson there was, because this process is monthly and because we don't go through that iteration once and we're done with it, there was the opportunity to learn from that first time through and to learn from those mistakes and figure out, like, what were those items that we missed. Was it an attention to detail? Was it our lack of understanding? Was it bad data that we started with? What was the root cause behind that, so that when we went through iterations 2 and 3 in the next months, those problems didn't rear their heads again.
I want to rewind just a sec, but the day before those first iteration reports went out, how are you feeling at that point?
The day before, honestly, pretty good.
I would imagine.
Because I think, again, like, we felt confident in the amount of care and attention to detail that had gone into preparing those reports. So until we started collecting that feedback, it's kind of that saying of,
you've like gone into this new space you've never really been in before. You've learned a whole bunch of information. You've developed a relationship with the client. You've gotten some familiarity with the process of how all this is calculated. You've improved the process, as you mentioned. Those are all real accomplishments, and getting to that point in time. Before that first report went out, how was the client? I mean, I imagine there was some trust that was built up to that point.
There was. And so, that was one of the very interesting things was, apart from just like preparing the calculation, which was our responsibility, like, that calculation did go through multiple levels of review. So, between HR, who is inputting the numbers into the payroll system so that the doctors can get paid, HR is reviewing the calculation. The CEO was reviewing the calculation. The operators of each of the regions reviewed the calculations and the scorecards for each of their groups. But again, I think probably all of those people have one thing in common, and that one thing is they're looking at compensation that is not their own, right? And so a doctor is going to have a lot more scrutiny over their own compensation than someone else's compensation. And so I think for us, it was more a matter of, we didn't know what we didn't know. And so when you go back and, like, before that first report goes out, before that first payroll gets issued, we felt confident because we had done the due diligence and everything that we had thought through and all those items that we had addressed. I think what we didn't realize was, here are the 5 things that you still didn't consider and account for in your process.
Yeah, and I would imagine, your emotions were very, very different, shortly thereafter. But I mean, you bring up this point, and I think there's a couple things I think that's always happening. We could apply this to every aspect of our life, but there's always a point, like, even when we're very, very comfortable with it, even after we've made mistakes, there's still going to be something new. There's some new element that's going to be there. But at any given point in time, it's easy to it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture, that now you have that insight. And now, 2 years later, or even just a couple iterations later, a lot of that has worked itself out. So at any given point in time, we look at that and we go, okay, at the very beginning of this project, you have some anxiety. This is a new experience for you. The client wanted to improve some things, or they wouldn't have signed on to be a part of this in the first place, right? So everybody's got good intentions. There were a lot of wins there. And then because that effort was put in there, you acquire new data points, and then now you go learn from that. And in the short term, it's probably going to be pretty uncomfortable, and there's going to be some, even if it's nobody's fault, there's going to be some, okay, we got to go fix this, and that's going to create new anxiety. And what about my working relationship with these people? Is there still trust? How do we repair it? How do we get to the next level? But in 12 months, now you've got better communication. The client has more transparency. There's accuracy. The process is improved. Everybody's gotten through that. I think there are different points of time where it's easy to get caught up in the emotion of it. It's easy, and which I think is where the failure or the I don't want to have to deal with all this like negative energy or this is not a good comfortable situation to be in right now. But in a relatively short period of time, that becomes taken care of, assuming everybody's committed to improving.
It
Right?
does. And I think that was, to your point, that's the biggest piece is the one thing that we had in common on that project is everyone was pulling in the same direction, and so when you talk about that level of trust and kind of maybe the trust that went into our team in preparing the calculation and maybe even some of the steps in the review process where, we could have vetted these things out. Maybe there was almost too much trust at that time. But certainly like as we work through those other iterations, first off, like learning about some of those things that we didn't account for that we needed to was a very humbling experience. And the biggest thing there was, again, just putting yourself in the doctor's shoes and understanding the implications on their side of those items. And whether that was, I mean, in some instances we had doctors that were overpaid, which was great for them until we had to ask them to either pay us back or let them know that in their next paycheck we were going to be truing that up. And then we had doctors that were underpaid that could figure it out, and they were not happy because they wanted to be made whole. And so those were the things we had to walk through those. And that was probably the hardest part, was admitting there was room for improvement when we took so much pride and effort into the original calculation. And then B, just having to walk through it with those doctors who were already high on emotions and, maybe a little bit less patient than we would have hoped for, but learning from them and hearing their point of view and, learning their side of the story, I think those were the things that were essential for us to get it right moving forward. In addition to having that level of care and that level of trust and the desire to get it right, and not just to say, hey, 80% is good enough. We want to get this thing perfect or as perfect as possible.
And I would say, like, uh, I don't have an accounting background, right? But I think to your earlier point, Jonathan, a lot of times it's, we're looking at a piece of paper, visualizing an org chart, and we have to accomplish this goal, and this statement goes out, and we're accounting for this or that. But I would say that forever moving forward on any project that you're going to be a part of, or anybody on that team, and I'm sure you've had similar experiences. Now you've got now you've got this human component that you're analyzing, or in the back of your mind, even of like, well, I want to make sure we account for this. And now that I think that makes you a significantly better accountant or
Yep.
whatever you're doing, because you're going to be able to catch or deal with things in a more human way, or account for some of those things that are the intangibles that can't be captured when you're looking at data points.
Right.
Well, I think that's a great example. Technical, something that probably I would say our audience can easily relate with. I want to go back in your time machine, Jonathan, and to a completely different example. If that was probably some more, day-to-day situations that, our audience can relate to, where are we going back in your past?
So we're going back to the beginning of my career, I'll say, just coming out of college and going into the workforce, really to have my first full-time job, which was as a teacher. I started out in the summer. I was helping to teach some high schoolers. I think it was geometry that I was helping with there. And then when I got my job in the fall, that was for 6th and 7th grade remedial math. So that's where I started my career at. What happened was I got through the summer and things were okay. Generally speaking, I was able to work with the students. I was able to teach what I needed to teach as a portion of that. But what I didn't have was, coming into the 6th and 7th grade bit, and having the ability to establish, we called it classroom culture, but it's effectively how your classroom operates. This is day-to-day procedures. People come in, they know to expect these different things as being a part of your classroom. And I didn't I didn't do a good job of that. I didn't have the appropriate level of context for what that's supposed to look like. So there was a lot of me coming in, not knowing how to do what it was that I needed to do, and not understanding that some of the things that I needed to do in order to make sure that things were going to be successful weren't what you would consider the core part of what it is that you do. Like, we talk about a lot in our line of work. Oh, I was in meetings all day, and so I didn't get to do my actual real work. And very similarly, it was like, okay, I'd spent so much time doing behavioral corrections or whatever else it happened to be that I didn't spend any time doing my real work, which was teaching, not understanding that all of these things come into play and it all makes up a gigantic whole. And there was, I didn't have those abilities, and I didn't have the ability to see everything that I needed to see at that
Can you
point.
give me an example? Because I'm imagining you in a classroom. You kind of know if I'm understanding you
Mhm.
correctly, there's the curriculum, there's the goals, there's
Mhm.
what we want to teach, and sounds like you're very familiar with that. But the
Mhm.
actual transfer of knowledge or getting the students to engage and go
Mhm.
through that learning experience, is that kind of what you're?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So it's I came in and I had lesson plans and everything, and I was ready to go in and do what it was that I needed to do there. But the problem was, what are you going to do with like kids coming in late? What if they come in and do they have assigned seats, and then do they start talking to this person over here, and then all of a sudden, maybe there's tension like going on over there, and how do you catch that early enough in order to be able to mitigate it before all of a sudden it turns into something much bigger? And then you're over here and you're dealing with this particular behavioral problem that's going on this side of the classroom, and then on the complete opposite end of the classroom, two people are going at it over there, and then it's like, okay, how do I go from over here to over there? And I'm just feeling completely
And you're in your early
overwhelmed.
20s.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm
Okay.
right at, I'm
Yeah.
like 21, 22 years old, and I'm trying to mitigate all this stuff. Don't have any kids. I'm like, I don't know what to do here. All I feel like I'm doing is just wrangling up people and preventing people from killing each other. And that's basically it.
That was success, actually. Not
That's
kidding.
and that's a lot of people were saying that at the time. It was like, sometimes you just have to measure success as like nobody died. It was fine. But it was when every day was like that. It was like, how do we make sure that these kids are learning something in the middle here? Because my job ultimately is to teach them. It's not to babysit them.
Yeah, and I would imagine you had a passion. I mean, that's part of why you probably pursued it. So you got a passion for educating or helping people get to that next level, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah.
must have been incredibly frustrating for you to go home at the end of, or after the class, or go home at the end of the day or weeks. Like, what were you feeling, and how did that evolve over what time period?
I felt a lot of things. I felt a lot of stress. I felt a lot of anxiety, and I was pretty depressed at the time. Honestly, it's one of those things where it's early in life, and you think the world looks a particular way, and it just doesn't. Like, you saw things through one perspective your entire life, and you didn't have that experience where all of a sudden you could zoom out and you could go, yeah, well, you're just a part of something that is much bigger, and here's what all of that stuff looks like, right? Like, you come into it, and everybody does when they're young. They come into whatever industry, whatever thing it is that they have, and it's very idealistic, right? It's I'm going to be some sort of change that's going to be in the middle of all this stuff. Like, I'm going to be helping. And then you get into the middle of certain situations, and you start to find things, you didn't have to deal with it for the beginning portion of your life. Everybody told you throughout the beginning of your life, like, oh, you can do like whatever it is that you want to do. And then you get into that spot, and then you find out there are things way bigger than you that have been there way longer than you, and like they're much scarier than you are. And those things, like you just don't understand the level and the magnitude of what it is that you're up against.
Now, you had people who were senior to you.
Mhm.
You had other, people who'd been in this institution for a while. What
Mhm.
what did you ask for help? What did you do? How did
I
you react?
did, and that's something that I'm still trying to work through right now. The lessons to be learned from that experience. I did go through and I did ask for help. I don't think I knew what to ask for is a big part of the problem. I'd go into different things and there were certain things that I was willing to do, but then there were other things that I don't know if that's a young person thing or like what it is, but it's not being able to see, hey, these people are telling you something and that thing is very important and you're kind of dismissing that as something else, and like now all of a sudden you're seeing like, years and years later you can see like, oh well, that was kind of, yeah, that was a lot more spot on than it was. Or there's different bits. So I think there's multiple things that happen there. I think one of it is I didn't know how to ask for the type of help that I needed, and the other thing is when people would give me some of the answers that I would need, I don't know if I was as receptive to some of those things at that time.
I don't know about you, but I'm listening to this and I'm like, okay, that he was 21, 22 years old, and I'm like, I feel like the last few years I've encountered a lot of the same things. How about you? I mean, just in terms of like you specifically, I want to accomplish this, or I want a different experience than the one I'm getting. I don't know how to get it, but I sometimes don't even know how the heck what even to ask to help myself get it. Or I'll be honest, I'm stubborn sometimes. Sometimes, one person might be wanting to help and tell me something, and I might receive that in one way. And then I might sit down and 20 minutes later with a completely different person. And for whatever reason, there's a connection and I'm more open-minded to it. But how about you? Does any of this resonate with you?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely does. I think, the one thing that I found very interesting, and the whole concept of being a teacher is so foreign to me, but you think about like the responsibilities that you have as a teacher, and obviously there is this learning component, but also like the managing the students piece, I think is probably overlooked in large part to like what makes that job so difficult. And so, kind of coming in with certain expectations and maybe a game plan or a vision of how you're going to go about something, and then just the situation necessitates a change or a deviation from that plan. In some ways it almost sounds like, Jonathan, maybe your focus had to be more on just like keeping kids from killing each other, and look, at the end of the day, to your point, like there's different measures of success, right? And so I think sometimes it is also having like that perspective of, not what did you set out to accomplish, but looking back in hindsight, what did you actually accomplish? And those two things I think can be very different sometimes.
For probably a shorter period of time, but for like 3 months, I taught a freshman sophomore class at Ohio State. And I can relate to some of the, like, my dream scenario would be to walk in and I'm inspiring a class of 30 people and they're all showing up on time and they're asking questions and they're engaged and like
Yep.
all of them want to go start their own business. It was an entrepreneurship course.
Yeah.
The reality was is that people would show up late. Most people were somewhat checked out.
Yep.
But there were like 3 of the 30 who, they might spend a little bit of time after class or do something. And I found that to be rewarding. Now, I was 31, 32 years old at the time. So 10 years of more experiences for you. But what part felt like failure for you? And then what happened? Like, what happens next?
I often say that is the only point in my life that I truly consider to be a failure because I quit. And that's like, I mean, most of the time, when I initially got what this podcast was of greatest failures, it's the only one that I can really think of because just about everything else I was able to go through, was able to work through things. I was able, I sat there in it and said, okay, we need to find a way to be able to move through this. That's the only time that I ever sat there and was like, can't do it. That's it for me.
And the feeling of failure, was it more the day-to-day during or more the
I think it was
day
afterwards.
after?
I think it was afterwards. I felt like I was failing during it for sure because I came here to teach and I'm not teaching. Like this is the point of this and I'm not doing that. There was that felt like a failure that was day in, day out. And then there was also the afterwards of like, yeah, you did quit on that. Yeah, you did leave the kids. Yeah. Like that's the reality of the situation. Like you left.
And what happened then? What happened next in your life?
That's after that I got my job at PwC. I was unemployed for about a month, I think. And then I had a friend who was working over at PwC, and then he put in a recommendation for me, and I started up there. I started at like a kind of like hourly position. So it was like they called it a paraprofessional. So you were basically like beneath like an associate. An associate would be like what you came out of college as. And so like I started out as a paraprofessional, and I was like, that's fine. I'll do that for a bit. And then that's how my accounting career got started.
Leaving the classroom environment
Mhm.
with some of those feelings and frustrations, and
Yeah.
then say a few months after you'd made the transition to doing something completely different,
Yeah.
what's your inner dialogue at that point?
I was actually very thankful to had the position that I had in the office, because one of the biggest things that I know this about me now, didn't know it about myself at the time, was if I have to stand up and just attend to people's needs constantly, like standing up in front of them, talking to them, not getting a chance to just basically stop talking and do something, for like not getting that break in things. It just wasn't for me. I knew when I was ending my time there, I just want to go work in an office where people leave me alone for a bit and I can just go do my work and then come back and those type, like that type of bit. But I was not at a space where I think I was like, I don't know if you want to call that emotionally mature enough or whatever, but I didn't have that ability to be able to sit there in front of people and just do that day in, day out. So I was actually very thankful when I got my office job, because it was, okay, this is going to give me what it is that I wanted in order to be able to build up to wherever else it is that I want to go.
There's layers to this, of
Yeah.
course, but I mean, if you deconstruct it's a different environment,
Mhm.
and there's some positive reinforcement now going on within you, which had to, I don't know, I mean, build a little bit of confidence. It had to make you feel like a little bit more stable, or, you're not having all this like chaos going on
Yeah.
inside you every single day.
Yeah.
And you got new reps, new practice reps, new situations you were in.
Mhm.
You look back on both of those environments now, knowing
Yeah.
what you know. What do you know about yourself now?
Yeah. I think the first thing is I still refer back to the time that I was a teacher. There's lots of things that I learned, and it might have been inadvertent things that I was learning during that time. It might not have been the primary focus. These are things that would have resolved the issues that I had at the time, but they're things that I was able to carry forward and through into other parts. I'm sure I've mentioned them before, some of the stuff before on other podcasts that we've done here. So there's that. And then that finding something that is right for you at a particular point in time, that's something that I've also been able to carry into other positions that I've gone over to. I don't think I really truly regret having any of the jobs that I've had over time, because I made decisions to go into specific jobs for particular reasons. Each of them had a purpose behind them of, I'm leaving this environment and I am going into this environment, and my hope in going into that environment is to gain whatever it is that I'm looking to gain out of that new environment. And so that's something that I've been able to carry into each of the transitions that I've had from jobs, time in, time out.
I've quit things before, and I mean, sometimes you're quitting on, I don't want to deal with these, whatever, for me, negative types of whatever.
Mhm.
A bad boss, boring work, whatever.
Mhm.
And then, but then there's, on the other side of that too, there's also something I'm pursuing. I want
Mhm.
more fulfillment. I want to make a bigger impact. I want to learn something. What I'm hearing, like work environment has, you could do the exact same thing here.
Mhm.
And then in this environment, it's a very different experience than over here in this environment.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that, and I think also like a lot of my backgrounds. I mean, maybe to an outsider, some of it'll look a lot similar, but a lot of it's quite different. Like because it was I went from being a teacher, then I went into corporate America, right, and I'm working as in tax, and then from an accountant's perspective, we know there's a difference between tax and audit, and I went from being in tax to then going over to audit, and then now I'm in business transformation. These are all completely different areas of life, in like not life, but they're all different areas of work. And So yeah, like there might be some similarities between those. Like I'm doing the same thing, but like over here, I think a lot of it's like reshaping your brain and going like, okay, well, how do I take some of the things that were in that past environment, and then how do I like reframe it into a way that kind of fits into this new space, which is like I'm doing something different, but I did learn things in the past that I'm able to plug in over
Yeah,
here.
and to me that's you look at and you go, okay, there's I don't know, there's 1,000 people who do this type of business transformation, or
Hmm.
who let's just say use this technology to do business transformation for companies in this particular space.
Hmm.
All those people have that in common. But what's unique about you is that you come from tax and you also have the classroom perspective. And every one of those
Yeah.
people has that layer to them as well.
Mhm.
But I think you could even characterize that being in those different environments, whether it be failure, whether it being just you changed as a person, whether it be whatever,
Yeah.
you have become a better and more versatile problem solver,
Hmm.
essentially, and how to take all of that knowledge and then now go apply it to the next project that you're on. And then I would say, in your case, of all the people who do what you do, right, what makes you even more dangerous is that you've been a part of something where you got to actually share some of that experience of what would maybe be a number on a balance sheet to somebody else. For you is now there's like a name of a human being associated with it, and having a lens into their life of how that affects them on a day-to-day basis, right? So that makes both of you that much better at what you're doing and carrying that into the next problem. How do you see it?
No, I absolutely agree with that. I think, Jonathan's story to me is so fascinating because I think when you think about accountants, like so many of us come from just the traditional background of I went to college, I got my accounting degree, and I started in Big Four, and here I am, and kind of this one space is all I've ever known. And so when I think about it from that perspective, like, yes, teaching is such a different environment and so maybe not fundamentally different from accounting, but there's a lot of differences there. And I would imagine for you, there's probably a lot of opportunity to learn things about like, how do I manage other people? How do I manage specific situations? And, each of those elements, to your point, taking them and applying them into different situations, like I almost think of it as the further apart that two situations are where you can still take lessons from one and apply them to the other makes you even that much more versatile than here are two very similar situations, and the learning lessons that I took in situation A, now I'm applying them to B because they're the same thing. Like that in my mind requires a little bit less critical thinking and problem solving than the example of I've gone from one industry to another industry to now a different subsection of that industry. And so to be able to connect those dots, I think is, you know, not only incredible, but just, a really rare skill set to have.
I'm not thinking of anything specific, but I'm feeling something, right? Of almost at any given point in my life, I've had countless different jobs and failures and changes and stuff along the way. But at one particular moment, it feels like a failure, or it feels like frustration, or maybe it's only a failure in the sense that there was something that I set out to accomplish that I got so focused on that it had to be this way. And even if there were growth and opportunities and I'm improving at certain areas, or that unlocks some door 3 years from now that I can't even conceive, sometimes in the moment, I didn't feel good about my
Yep.
situation. And then now looking back, in 2 years, I may be doing something that I wouldn't be able to do, or maybe I, another thing, sometimes failure creates enough frustration for you to use the frustration as fuel to make an important change that maybe, like, I could tell you, hey, this would maybe be a good idea, or I think here's another option for you. And at the time, maybe whatever, that doesn't sound right. But then, something happens, something changes. It could be a catalyst too. So, I mean, you get knowledge from failure, you get fuel from failure to break through or just even change directions. I find that even on a day-to-day basis, sometimes I still kind of focus on what's not going right. And that isn't always the healthiest way to look at it.
Yeah, it's like it's very difficult. when you're in the middle of something, to be able to pull yourself out of it and go, this is a part of a much larger narrative. It's generally speaking not only until later that we sit there and we look back on things after a million sleepless nights and just being up worrying about all the different mistakes that we've
A
made.
million. What are you, like 270 years old? I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
right.
I'm kidding.
That was
That
just high
number's
school.
not
The
even
million,
accurate,
a million
yeah.
different mistakes was just high school. But like going back through and like sitting there and there's in a moment feeling that discomfort, and I think it goes. I hate the word discomfort because that makes it seem so like it's almost like, like you have like an ache, not an actual pain, but like in the moment it feels like actual pain of like, this is very intense and I don't like this and I don't, like anything about it. And also you're reacting to things and you're not liking the way that you're reacting to things. And it's everything becomes this gigantic ball of like not good. And it's not until later that you can sit there and you can start dissecting everything and going like, okay, there was an initial problem and here was the problem with the initial problem. But then you can also go wider and go, and then there's a way that I reacted to everything. And I didn't particularly like the way I reacted to everything. And like, how do so there might be a lesson that's in the middle of that initial bit of discomfort of like, okay, so I learned, like maybe in your particular example, right? Like it's maybe I learned in that particular example of like, okay, here's what to look for when we're dealing with payroll issues in the future. Like I have a checklist now and I go through those different things. But then there's also a secondary component to it too, which is, okay, and we know that problems are going to arise because again, we don't know, we're going to be in situations where we don't know what we don't know. And the question isn't around, how do I make sure that I know everything in the entire universe so that way all of a sudden I never run into a situation where I don't know what I don't know. You're going to be in situations where you don't know what you don't know. The question is, how do I deal with that component of things? Like, how do I make sure that we have all the information that we need? Or if I know that I'm not going to have all the information that I need before I need to put something out, how do we have a system put in place where all of a sudden it's, okay, now I'm getting feed. Like there's that ancillary component to things, which is like how do I personally handle not just the fail, like on my part, like it's not just about, oh, well, this is how you instill discipline in a classroom. Like if that's all it is that I took out of that wouldn't be sufficient to be able to handle like what it is that I'm trying to get at. Like at the end of the day, it's, okay, so you were given a difficult situation and like, how do we make sure that we have perseverance in order to be able to get through there? How do we lean on other people in order to be able to get what it is that we need to get like from help? Like, how do I ask for that type of help? What does that help look like? What is, like what are the important parts of your job that exist outside of the core component of what you consider your job? Like there's lots of other things that are there. Those are all like the ancillary components to like trying to be able to figure out like what do I take away from this? It's not just, okay, well, I took away that specific thing. It's how do I take away all these other things around like I can't predict I can't predict every difficult situation I'm going to be in, but I can sit there and go, okay, but how am I going to react to that? That is something that I can predict. I know I'm going to get in situations that I don't know these things, but that's okay because I know I'm going to be able to react to it in this way.
There's a few things going on at the same time. One is there's if I have this job or if I'm in, studying this, right, I can check this box, check this box, check this box, and and then I pass, right? So in that sense, it's successful. But I think that the growth or what makes you good at something happens when there's a variable you hadn't accounted for, or you fail. And more specifically, you feel the consequences of the failure, because then it's like, I can sit here and tell you both, don't touch that fire. You're going to get burns on your hand. Right. And it's logical. You understand it. Yep. You could even see me put my hand in the fire and jump back and like see my flesh all melted. Right.
Yep.
You still learn the lesson, but once you've actually burned your hand in the fire, now you actually appreciate that. And so that's one lens. To deconstruct that even a little bit, it's almost like we're in these little silos of false comfort. And so if we stay in that silo, I can theorize all of the things that could be done. But until I go do those things and then get some response from other people or the real world or the situation or have a bad experience, then I can't actually, there's not real accumulated knowledge that I can apply. And then to your point, at the same time, there's this developing this, I don't know how I would characterize it, but like mental toughness or self-awareness to understand that these things are going to continuously be happening. And no matter how much I know, no matter how much I've accomplished, there will always be more stuff that I don't know. And the world, by the way, is constantly changing. So that is never going to change, even if we want it to. So then how do I deal with these situations? That's what I'm getting out of this. And I think if we're going to leave our audience with some takeaways here, what's something that you would recommend that either you're applying to yourself on how to navigate the day to day of all this chaos happening and just part of growing and being better at life and whatever, versus the, the actual, like, these are the things that make me good at what I do. How do you manage that?
I guess the one takeaway that I would give and that I've felt from this conversation is, we kind of have this, I'll call it a taboo on failure. People don't like talking about their failures. In some ways, people like to give this perfect and ideal impression of themselves, and I think when you look at like where we're at as a society, there is a component of society that plays into that. You look at social media and like people want to present these perfect, flawless pictures. And you think about like, how many times do you post on Instagram? How many times are you taking that one picture to get the right angle and the right lighting, and all of those perfections and not the flaws and the failures. So I think there's a little bit of this taboo around failure and imperfection. The one thing that I would say is I've been in points in my life where I've intentionally avoided failure and even just exposure and that risk, not where I went above and beyond to make sure I didn't fail, but I intentionally avoided situations where I could fail. What I found in those moments was, as an individual and as a professional, I wasn't growing during those times, because I wasn't putting myself out there and taking risks and, being okay with failing. I wouldn't grow as quickly as when I did, and when I had to walk through those and see what the outcome was and get on the other side of those moments. So from my standpoint, failure, while it's something that none of us are proud to admit, and obviously we don't want to make mistakes and we don't want to fail, there is an important component of embracing those failures so that you can learn from them and so that you can apply those lessons going forward in life and any other situations that you're in.
That's great perspective. Can relate to that too. There's times when like you almost want to, like, I want to be in an environment where I do feel safe maybe for a little bit, but then the growth does stop, right? That's so true. How about you, Jonathan? Is there any, I mean, hearing you, I'm wondering do you feel like you're more likely to put yourself in a situation like that now because of what you've learned painfully through some of those failures previously in your life?
Yeah, I actually, so I might have talked about before on a different podcast, but like my sport now is like, I started jujitsu last year, and that was something that I intentionally was seeking out because it is an environment where you have to fail often. Like, it's just, you can't go into it and then expect, like, nobody's good at it when they first go into it. Like, you're gonna fail and you're gonna fail and fail again and everything, and you have to be able to learn from that in order to get better. And I'm now in my life where I'm looking for environments where that is going to happen, because it's a particular skill that I think you have to place yourself in. And it doesn't have to be that. It can be like whatever it is. If you're going in and you're doing public speaking stuff and you start up, doing Toastmasters or whatever it is, like just finding an environment where it's, okay, I'm going to go in this thing and I have an understanding that I'm going to be bad at it. And it's maybe it is a particular skill, that skill itself is something that you want to own. But there's another component to it too, which is like, I need to develop that concept of perseverance through difficult situations. And that's something that I'm willing to do. And I'm also willing to put myself in an environment where everybody who's in there is collectively working towards the same thing. And we were actually talking about this yesterday or the day before, but it was, when we surround ourselves with people who are all working towards a common goal, and then that just becomes the norm of, I go into this environment and I'm surrounded by people who are all trying to do the same thing, and that's inevitably becomes a particular part of yourself that you build up. So definitely, like, now it's that's something that I value, is being able to go to environments where everybody's there, and they're there because they want to challenge themselves, and they know they're going to fail, and that's okay. It's not about, oh, well, I have to be perfect. It's actually about, like, no, like, this is a completely imperfect place and everybody's doing things imperfectly. We all recognize that we're doing things imperfectly, but the point is to make each other better. So we're all collectively here to make each other better. And those are spaces that I want to be in now, versus spaces where it's, no, you have to put up that front that you were talking about, where it's like, like, I generally actively avoid social media. And the big part of the reason why I do that is because I just don't want to be in an environment where all it is that facade that is, here is what my perfection looks like. And you don't see, the tons of hours that it is that I've put into something, like behind the scenes, and the tons of pictures that, like, I had to take in order to do this, or the honing in of makeup skills, or like whatever it is that, like, I've had to do over time in order to get this result. All you end up seeing is the result. And then you feel like, well, I got to have that thing. Being in an environment where everybody actively embraces the fact that they're constantly failing, like, that's something that now I look for, and I want to be a part of those communities.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it says about y'all two, but I will say that I get a lot of value from my conversations with you two. So, I think about PR, and I think about social media, and I think, every big organization has to maintain this never really acknowledging, failure, never, But I think that, I'll only speak for myself, although I sense that, it's something I share in common with you two, and it's something I would imagine that, because that's how things are publicly all throughout society, that there are a lot of people who are starving for a connection with people who are okay with being vulnerable. And I like talking with you two, and we become friends because I think I appreciate that there is a level of, like, authenticity, and, like, it's okay to talk about our failures. And I think that in turn, I come to you guys sometimes when I'm having some challenges, because it's like, I want to get your perspective, mainly because I know that you've failed many times. And so you probably got a lot of wisdom, as opposed to, like, I'm not proactively seeking to go to the person who's, like, always perfect and always says the right things and never acknowledges any weakness or failure. Like, I don't want to go to that person, because what am I going to learn from them? So I think, I don't know if I'm doing a good job bringing up, but there's something there. I think, like, seeing that authenticity, but to your point, I find that you both share that growth mindset, and that's, that, like, hey, failure is going to happen, and it's nice to be around people, sub ecosystems within a bigger ecosystem, or friends, or, jujitsu, clubs that you're going to on a regular basis. But, like, everybody's there because they want to embrace that growth mindset. And then being in that environment strengthens everybody. But also, everybody's showing up every day despite all of those failures. So it gets reinforced on another level. So, we've got mindset, there's habits here, there's who you surround yourself with. And then I think, part of just, like, accepting that there's always going to be something new that is going to get in your way.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that either of you would add to that?
No.
All right. My final question then: as leaders, you both manage teams, you develop people. We've got all different kinds of personalities. You've got team goals. You've got different dynamics and challenges that are part of the equation. But is there anything that you can do, or have you done as a leader, to create an environment where the people who at least are on your team are more comfortable with talking about failure, or taking chances, and learning, and reinforcing all the things we've talked about?
So there's one thing for me, and this is something that I picked up kind of in my sports background, but I've always been of kind of the philosophy that you win as a team and you fail as an individual. And what I mean by that is, when you have successes, give the credit to other people, because even if, may be the one managing that situation, or the one directly involved in whatever the success is, it's not possible without the support and the guidance of those people around you. So I've always found it important that when you have success, give the credit to other people. And likewise, when you fail, take ownership of that. Number one, it helps hold yourself accountable and recognize that you're not perfect and there are areas that you can improve. But two, I think it gives confidence being a leader for other people to see, hey, this person isn't afraid to own up to, this mistake, or that they're maybe shielding me from some of the fallout of this situation and the ramifications of that. I think it makes other people more likely to put themselves out there and to take that own risk. And as long as they approach it with the right mindset and that eagerness to grow and develop as a human being, and understand that, hey, I may make a mistake, I may fail. That's part of the learning process. And as long as I approach it with the right attitude and, have an open mind and willing to learn through walking through this, that to me, I think is the most important thing.
The best thing that I've ever had a manager do for me, and like the best thing that like I feel like I can do as a manager, is like admit when you're wrong and say that you're sorry. If you can do those things instead of making it, if all you do as a manager is blame everybody else for the situation that you're in, then what do you think everybody else on your team's going to do? If you think that all of a sudden they're going to start taking responsibility for things, like, no, of course they're not going to take responsibility for anything, because you don't take responsibility for anything. So when you sit there and you go, yep, I missed that one, that's on me. Like, we can, like, I need to do better at this. And then they need to see the follow-up action that you're doing as a portion of that, right? Like, I missed that. I need to do a better job reviewing. Let's just call it that. I need to do a better job at reviewing these types of things. I'm going to do a better job of that in the future. Or, hey, I didn't communicate that stuff with you. That's totally on me. That is not on you for missing this bit. Even if you can be like, like, and everybody can do this, right? Like they can sit there and they can nitpick and they can be like, oh, well, you should have asked me for this thing, or you should have like done, yeah, shoulda, coulda, woulda, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, if you just sit there and you just go, no, the buck stops here. It was my fault. I didn't tell you that thing. That's me. You're going to get that a lot. You're going to get the same exact response like back from them, like in terms of like, hey, I messed this thing up. And that also has like a benefit in that when people do mess up, you find out about it sooner, rather than like somebody messes something up and they're so focused on being perfect that they're just trying to cover it up and make sure that nobody notices that like they messed up. And then all of a sudden you get to the end of the day, and it's like, hey, why is all this stuff messed up? Like, we got to send this thing out tomorrow. And now I can't. If they would have told you a while back, but the only way that they're going to tell you a while back is when you're admitting in real time that you're making mistakes. That's when they're going to be willing to admit in real time that they're making mistakes. And then that helps them grow. It helps you grow. It just helps everybody.
It's funny. You got these two competing forces, is a choice, if you will, of which one, if you want to project that same pull that we feel on maybe social or PR, it's like perfection. I never make any mistakes. I point fingers, then you'll get that, and nobody's really going to grow. And at some point there won't be anybody else left to to blame, or the complete opposite can happen. And maybe it's a little uncomfortable at times, but I think it definitely, again, talking about YouTube, brings you closer to people. And, I think being around y'all, you're, I don't want to say hard on yourselves, but it's very obvious that you're mindful of different things, and have a level of self-awareness that I think is refreshing. So I can see how your teams would feel the same way and be comfortable too. So great discussion, guys. Appreciate you being comfortable with peeling back the layers and, analyzing failure from some different lenses. But I know I always learn from you. So I hope our audience gets a lot of value, and really grateful for you spending some of your time today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.